Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the eRenew webinar series on Europe in the World. I am Carrie Ottoburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I will be your host and moderator. Today, we are joined by Professor Joachim Schild and Professor Dirk Schmidt, both from the University of Trier, who will be discussing their new book, EU and US Foreign Economic Policy Responses to China, The End of Naivety, which was published in 2023 by Routledge. Joachim Schild is Chair of Political Science and Comparative Politics at the University of Trier. His research focuses on the political economy of European integration, economic governance of the Eurozone, and Franco-German relations in the EU. Dirk Schmidt is Chair of Politics and Economics of China at the University of Trier. His work focuses on political economy, foreign policy, and foreign economics of the People's Republic of China and Chinese-Taiwan relations. Also joining us today as expert discussant is Professor Michelle Egan. Michelle Egan is Professor of Politics, Governance, and Economics and Jean Monnet Chair ad personam at the School of International Service at American University, as well as Global Fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Professor Egan focuses on comparative politics and political economy. She works on Europe and the United States with a focus on issues of federalism, trade, governance, and law. We will begin today's webinar with the presentation by Joachim and Dirk of approximately 25 minutes, after which we will turn to Michelle to kick off the discussion by offering some reflections and asking a few questions, to which the authors will have an opportunity to respond. Then we will turn to questions from you, the audience. So please feel free to send questions for the speakers at any point throughout the webinar by using the webinar Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. So when those questions occur to you, don't hesitate, just send them through the Q&A function, and I will collect them to share with the speakers during the Q&A session, which will follow the presentations. Before we begin, just a few words about the eRenew project. The EU Research and Education Network on Europe and the World, or eRenew as we call it, is an Erasmus Jean Monnet network bringing together 19 higher education institutions from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, with the goal of improving knowledge and enhancing debate on the EU's role in an ever-changing world. On behalf of eRenew, I would like to thank Joachim, Dirk, and Michelle for joining us today. And it's now my great pleasure to pass the floor to Dirk, who I believe will be kicking off today's presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Carrie, and thank you very much to the organizers for having us on this webinar and to all of you for your interest. And we are looking forward for your input. Actually, this is the first time since the book came out that we have the opportunity to share our results and put them to, discussion. Okay, so Joachim, if you can start with the slides. So we start with, we decided to split up our work, so I kick off and then Joachim very shortly is going to take over. And so then the overview or the structure of the book is on the next slide. It's exactly the structure of the book, and we focus on two aspects in the presentation. With the asterisks here, it's the EU response and the US response. Why I highlighted number 3 here, or point 3, is the China challenge. So we talked about in the book about China's changing place in the international economy, the reciprocity gaps, unlevel playing field, China in the WTO, and then had some remarks on the socialist market economy, and especially what changed under Xi Jinping after 2012. So then after 2 lengthy chapters on the EU and the US, then we do the comparison and in the end have an outlook that's formulated in the form of a question. So the research questions are threefold. The first is about the extent to which the EU and US changed their foreign economic policies towards China. So we asked the question, is this more of a limited, incremental, or a full-blown paradigmatic policy change? And how likely would it be durable? Yeah. And so the second question asks for the reasons for this degree of policy change. And we try to look at ideational shifts, changing economic interest groups, thinking and interests, so security concerns, how they relate to, well, traditional economic efficiency considerations. And then the third part looked at the differences between the EU and the US as such. And then it's Joachim taking over with some remarks on the research design.
Yeah, basically, the starting point was to think, where do the two actors, EU and the US, come from, and what was the underlying paradigm guiding their foreign economic policies in general and towards China in particular, and what might be a trajectory of change that we can then assess in how far they went down this road towards change and towards potentially subscribing to a new or different paradigm. So, by the way, thank you for my part as well for inviting me, for giving me the opportunity to join in and lay out some ideas contained in our book. So basically, the point, the common starting point was that both the EU and the US subscribed to a liberal international economic paradigm. There were differences with regard of the varieties with regard to the exact nature of the underlying paradigm for their foreign economic policy or policies in the plural. The US approach or paradigm has been dubbed being an ad hoc globalization paradigm, meaning that especially since the 1990s, US tried to build ad hoc cross-border links through unilateral choices and a host of bilateral trade and investment treaties concluded with other parts of the world, whereas the EU more subscribed to what has been called managed globalization paradigm, which is more multilateral in its approach, more rules and principle based, and adding some other element to free trade, namely trade and environment trade and labor, promotion of labor standards, trade and promotion of human rights standards, and also to a certain extent trying to share the cost of adjustment in opening up to globalization. The first question was how far went this change? So we used these two paradigms of liberal internationalism with a focus on maximizing individual economic welfare, emphasizing absolute welfare gain, and advocating free trade and a rules-based order, to an alternative, namely an economic nationalist, or you might also call it neo-mercantilist paradigm, which underlines the primacy of the state, maximization of collective prosperity, not individual one, stressing national security and military power, and the economic basis and resources for military power, and which puts the emphasis on relative welfare gain and uses instruments or an approach of strategic protectionism, not fully subscribing to free trade ideas, and also internally using instruments of industrial policy, sector-specific vertical forms of industrial policy are part of this approach. So we tried then to break this down in what does this mean in terms of indicators that would show us that either the US or the EU or both would be moving from a liberal international economic paradigm towards economic nationalism or neo-mercantilism. And we came up with the idea that this should be reflected, such a change, in a discursive change showing that different underlying values and principles guide their foreign economic policies, not only the ones which are part of the liberal internationalist paradigm, but such goals and principles and underlying values as sovereignty, resilience of foreign economic exchanges and relations, and autonomy and security goals that are pursued by actors which are imbued or subscribing to an economic nationalist paradigm. We should also see a change in instruments, new instruments, more defensive instruments, of a mercantilist, neo-mercantilist type, but also perhaps not only defensive, but also offensive instruments to deal with a strategic competitor, a competitor that is not only an economic competitor, but also a strategic competitor in a power in a power competition game. And we would also expect then changes in the use of existing instruments, notably defensive instruments such as trade defense instruments that are in place since decades. Okay, and why should we expect, or where should we locate the drivers for change that inspire the US and the EU foreign economic policies to change towards a economic nationalist approach in their foreign economic policies? And here we argue basically that the drivers for change are notably to be found in the international external environment and in China's rise in the international division of labor, its relative gain in power resources and economic power, but also at the level of behavioral changes, which are considered being a challenge to both the US and the EU, namely its new foreign policy assertiveness of the last decade, but also specific strategies in terms of acquiring companies, high-tech companies, and critical infrastructures, both in the US and attempts in the EU as well. And another source of change for the perception of China and for the policy response towards China is at the domestic level. That was the big chapter 3 that we did not want to summarize here. So the structural features of the Chinese political economy and the party state capitalism, so to say, the party state, which is guiding and directing the economy in China. And these external challenges, so to say, they influence ideas, economic ideas that are underpinning foreign economic policies both in the US and in China. They also influence the preferences of private actors, especially China moving up the value chain, being competitive in fields that directly compete with producers both in the US and the EU. And they also, these external challenges shape public actors' policy preferences and serving as inputs for policy change in both the EU and the US. This view differs somehow, especially with regard to approaches in the past of the EU as an international actor, both in broader foreign policies, but also foreign economic policies, where the main emphasis was a kind of inside-out approach. What is the EU? What are we? How do we influence the world based on our model of a liberal power Europe, normative power Europe, or civilian power Europe? Our approach is rather the other way around. How does the changing world and rising geo-economic tension and rising power and economic cloud of China change the European Union and makes it adapt to different circumstances that it has to face? Okay, I'll move on with the EU response to this China challenge. At the level of discourses and paradigms, we did not see a fully fledged paradigm change, but rather a combination of old elements onto which new, more defensive, more neo-mercantilist elements were grafted. I mean, onto this pre-existing liberal paradigm. That means that the EU basically remains in principle committed to a multilateral and liberal approach wherever possible, wherever it can, but the discourse evolved towards an approach that stresses the need for acting autonomously, where the EU thinks it must act in a unilateral way and autonomously to face challenges of an unlevel playing field, of unfair competition, of being bullied by China, where China uses weaponizes interdependence, economic interdependence, to pursue political goals. And this approach, this combination of old and new, is nicely reflected in the label that the EU, the Commission has given to its trade policy, namely open strategic autonomy. Open reflecting the old liberal paradigm, strategic autonomy, new goals, underlying values guiding the EU's response to China and to a, in general, more hostile geopolitical environment. So that's on the conceptual and paradigmatic level, a mix of old and new, if you want. And that translated in terms of instruments used and developed into a what in the literature is more and more called a unilateral or unilateralist turn in the EU's foreign economic policy. That is not by choice, but by necessity, because a multilateral approach, for instance, to sharpen the rules of the WTO to handle and to deal with massive subsidization practices of China, this road is blocked. There is no possibility, no real option to change the rules, because China would never subscribe to that. So we have to think, the EU had to think about other options and other tools to face these challenges. And it did so by strengthening existing instruments, notably trade defense instruments in the field of anti-dumping and anti-subsidy policy. It reformed its basic regulations in both fields to be able to have until the present a certain treatment of China as a non-market economy. And it added a whole set of new instruments to the toolbox, and all this in a very short period of time, namely basically in 5-6 years. It added the foreign subsidy regulation, foreign direct investment screening, the so-called international procurement instrument, and the anti-coercion instrument. These are covered with shorter or longer case studies in the book. There are a number of different and additional changes that came by way of legislation at the EU level that also translate this unilateral or indicate this unilateral turn in the EU's policy. So FDI screening is mainly about checking foreign direct investments, notably from China, but not only, for public order and security risks, especially in the field of critical infrastructure. But one major concern that drove this change was also a fear of a sellout of cutting-edge technology, European cutting-edge technology, to Chinese firms. And the foreign subsidy regulation tried to fill some regulatory gaps state subsidy rules, they apply to EU member states, but not to China, to third parties that are present on the European market in the field of company takeovers or in the field of public bidding for public procurement contracts. And to create a more level playing field, this foreign subsidy regulation covers these fields as well and gives instruments at the hand of the EU to start investigations into subsidized bids for procurement contracts. The most recent example is an investigation started against a train constructing company in China that made a bid for constructing or delivering high-speed trains to Bulgaria, a project that was out in Bulgaria. An international procurement instrument in a similar way tries to put pressure on third parties, third states outside the EU, whose procurement markets are not as open as the procurement markets inside the EU. And the anti-coercion instrument is designed to have instruments available, different kind of sanctions as a deterrence instrument to deter foreign countries from trying to bully EU member states or the EU for some political or foreign policy reasons, and to use economic means, geo-economic strategies, and using economic means for political ends against some states inside the European Union. We also saw a new emphasis on, and still see in increasing intensity, the use of industrial policy instrument, sometimes very old-fashioned industrial policy approaches, vertical approaches, to develop or to support certain sectors or certain companies with public subsidies in order to guarantee the European competitiveness against competitors that have resort to massive subsidization of their own companies. Okay, overall, we see a kind of approach that might be described as conditional openness, meaning as long as our main competitors remain open in their foreign economic policies and their economies, we, the Europeans, can remain as open as we were in the past. But if they do not play the game, if they do not subscribe to the idea of level playing field, then we can use unilateral tools that have been developed. Okay, what explains this response very briefly, because I do not want to overstep our time. I think the perception of China changed a lot, because the earlier ideas that you can find in policy papers of the Commission, for instance, that China, after its accession to the WTO, will turn into a market economy, did not turn out to be justified and true, meaning that China did not transform into a market economy, which makes economic relations and exchanges with China are rather difficult. And China moved up the value chain, gained market shares, and is outcompeting many European policies in their fields of strength of in the past. And there was also a recognition or a view that foreign acquisitions of Chinese companies did not follow a random pattern, but were strategically guided by goals of acquiring cutting-edge technologies and spurring the internal economic development of China. And we had a kind of focusing moment in the year 2016, with a peak in foreign direct investments in Europe, Chinese foreign direct investments in Europe, a sudden peak, and some highly important takeovers, notably the robotics producer KUKA, German cutting edge and world market leader in that field, that has been taken over by Chinese companies. So that led to discursive changes, that led to an increase of security concerns underpinning or guiding European policies, notably in the field of critical infrastructure and their acquisition by China and Chinese companies. But it did not go as far as in the US, because the aspect of a strategic competition, which puts security concerns, military security concerns, at the heart of the picture, is more or less widely absent in the European case. We saw a change of economic interest driving this policy change, because the increasing import competition faced by European companies, but that made them call for more defensive instruments and made them more sensitive to leveling the playing field. And if we look at how these drivers for change translated into policy change, we have, of course, to look at institutions that process demands, that process new approaches and translate them into policies, concrete policies. And the typical pattern in the EU of those last years was that the response was mainly by way of legislative changes. Dirk will come back to that, or to the differences with regard to the US, where the autonomy of the executive is so much more pronounced than on the EU side, which needed incremental legislative changes to find an answer to the China challenge. Another difference that might be discussed later is that we still see in the European Union a more important free trade coalition that tries to slow down change towards economic nationalism compared to the US. So I'll stop here and hand over to Dirk.
All right, then. What I begin with is this chart that shows you basically following up on what Joachim just said. You see here, so to say, in 2018, which was the most dramatic trade deficit that the US had with China. We all know that economists refute the notion that trade deficits are bad. But at least for the Trump administration and for this conservative movement in the GOP, this is still very important today. And on top of that, we have a parallel situation when it comes to FDI, which we can see on the next slide. You see that in this orange, the orange columns above. So we see a peak in takeovers, acquisitions coming from China to the US. And what is interesting, you see in a down left side, the entry mode, most of the investments were acquisitions and only a smaller part greenfields. Whereas on the other hand, you see that there was kind of an unfounded focus on the party states, so state-owned enterprises taking over the US industry. So most of those money came from private enterprises, but of course, those who are familiar with China, separating the state and private companies is kind of a very tricky endeavor. And on the right-hand side of this chart, you see venture capital that also went into China. And there was this notion in the US that we, the US, built China. And this venture capital money going to China is, even though this slide stops in the year 2020, is still a very thorny issue in the US. Then we get to the US response as such. Well, the big difference with the EU picture is that in our understanding, there is a paradigmatic change, which we call the permanent disruption. Why permanent disruption? Because most observers expected Biden administration to change course and not to continue with, well, the policy legacies of the Trump administration, but this turned out to be not as expected. So we identified a third critical juncture, and so the first one being the US Civil War, and then the second one, the Great Depression in the 1930s. So a third critical juncture, and now kind of a return to a more economic nationalist paradigm. And we differentiate between two versions. EN here means economic nationalism. One under Trump, which was way more tariff related, more offensive or aggressive, whereas under Biden, the focus was on regulatory measures, as we call them, for status defense. So the US wanted to keep the #1 spot, so US hegemony or primacy against China, and so status defense and status denial by regulatory measures was the focus. And we call it proto-offensive, which means that the offensive steps are still not quite established. So it's more of a mix between passivity and offensive measures. But nevertheless, we still think it's a change to a neo-mercantilist economic nationalism. And here we use the terminology that had been introduced by Eric Helleiner. So the exact measures can be, so to say, split up in trade protectionism. T here means the Trump administration, and B, the Biden administration. So you see some differences. But when we worked on the topic in the book, we found out that it's astonishing to see that much of a policy continuity. So it's more in the details and also in the language when the two administrations talk about China than in the substance. So trade protectionism used to be more bilateral, transactional under Trump, more multilateral and restrained under Biden. So both have a focus on what they call the middle classes and the workers. And so trade protectionism mostly relies on delegated authority by trade laws going back to the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s. So with the regulatory changes, the respective measures pretty much are, well, shadow what the European Union did. I mean, sometimes, often enough, the US made a first step, but you see here, it's FDI screening, export controls, supply chains going far beyond what the European Union has been debating when it comes to security and also human rights concern with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, when the burden of proof was, so to say, flipped. And this is has been very far-reaching, at least in theory. So the concrete outcomes have to be still waited upon. Buy American, is astonishing that Buy American, so to say, had a renaissance, because this term coming out of the early 1930s, was tinged, so to say, but under Trump and also Biden, both used it. So in a nutshell, whereas Trump was rather chaotic and there was a partial approach to regulatory measures, under Biden it was way more synchronized and systematic. Domestic activism under Trump, pretty much in line with traditional Republican domestic economy focus, was on reducing the tax on regulatory burdens, whereas under Biden we see a return of industrial policies, in their own words, to outcompete China. You know the respective laws and measures, the Inflation Reduction Act or the Chips and Science Act. And interesting to compare the position on the WTO. The WTO in the US is a symbol of policy failure. It is the one thing that symbolizes everything that international trade regime did not, so to say, deliver on as promised. But whereas the Trump administration was very vocal in their attacks on the WTO, the Biden administration, as we call it, bypassed the WTO and focused more on alternative structures like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but it, intentionally shied away from any trade liberalization measures there. How can we explain this situation? One thing is the expectation delivery gap that Joachim talked about, but here it's way more than that. We call it China-related inevitabilities that date back to the 2000s. So when China joined WTO and when there was the permanent normal trade relations awarded to China, there was a lot of expectations, really a teleological understanding that China's admission would bring beneficial trade, interdependence, fosters peace. China would move towards a market economy, even towards a more democratic governance, would become a responsible stakeholder in the international system. All that clashed with reality. So we think about a multiplicity of China shocks. So not only the one that is very prominent, so with the distributive and economic fallout, but here everything related to engagement of China, so to say, was kind of delegitimized. So the status quo discredited, the intellectual underpinning, as we see it in the US, totally delegitimized. And the difference to the US is to the EU is, whereas the EU in its, so to say, in its genes, always open to multilateral trade. So the US has a tradition of protectionism getting back to earlier periods of the Republic. So that could be resurfaced and used. And it was very easy, and there was no need to look for a new, so to say, paradigm, because it was still there. It just been discarded, but it was still there also in the institutions. So China's perspective is primarily to this day as an exporter of techno-authoritarianism and main strategic competitor. With regard to the institutions, Joachim already mentioned that an outsized role of the president in this system, bicameral, bipartisan, anti-China hostility in Congress. If you look for veto players, you mostly find them within the administrations, both under Trump and under Biden. It's basically a pattern of the security, military, and intelligence agencies, plus the US Trade Representative on the one hand, and the departments of the Treasury, Commerce, and the National Economic Advisor on the other hand, and the basically a lack of judicial constraints. The interest groups basically on the defensive or well, fighting an uphill battle, as we call it, because now from the perspective of trade unions and human rights organizations and so on, they would compare the situation in the mid-2010s with the situation 1999, 2000, those discussions, and they feel vindicated. And so, which means that the pro-free trade liberal groups, business companies and the business groups, they were kind of only able to look for carve-outs and waivers with regard to the protectionist measures. And then is Joachim taking over again with the outlook.
Joachim, I think you're muted.
Now it should work. Sorry. So I leave the outlook for the discussion. I wanted to say, in a nutshell, we think that all the drivers towards change are still present, perhaps even more so. Geopolitical tensions on the rise, the economic nationalism in China on the rise. All those inputs are still there, leading us to expect that the turn towards economic nationalism will be ongoing or even be gaining in importance on both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joachim and Dirk, for this very interesting and thorough overview of the US and EU policy responses to China, and some of the key structures of your book. I would like to pass the floor over to Michelle now to kick off today's discussion, and I would like to also remind the audience that the Q&A is open, so please feel free to send any questions for the authors via the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window, and I will collect those to share with the authors during the Q&A session. Over to you, Michelle.
Congratulations, an excellent book. I'll start off with sort of saying, you know, this US strategy, trade strategy, has taken this geoeconomic turn that you've indicated. Europe has followed suit with a roster of legislation, whether this is starting with investment screening, continuing with export controls, foreign subsidies, anti-coercion, and so forth. The one thing that's notable in your book is the speed of adoption, the number of reforms in Europe in a short space of time over the last decade or less than a decade. And what's interesting in this book is both the US and EU are using a mix of new instruments as well as reform of methodology and modernization of existing policies. And the argument and highlight of the book is you're responding to both the weaknesses and applicability of WTO rules, and also the gaps in both the European and the US single market. And so the pandemic has certainly made policymakers more conscious of supply chains and dependence on China, which creates a double-edged sword. There are efforts to restrict and review foreign direct investment through screening mechanisms and things like that, while we're also dependent on items that are crucial for national security, for the green transition, for critical minerals, and for specific sectors. So this book steps into that debate, this excellent book. It focuses not just on the US and EU foreign economic policy changes towards China, which was the focus today, but it also focuses on this ideational shift of both governments and business in response to the structural changes in the global economy and the integration and moving up in the value chain of China. And so I wondered if this was a 21st century catch-up Gerschenkron model. And so my first sort of, I want to say just a couple of things about the China part, because that was less of the focus and it's enormously interesting. And what I really think here is there's a range of trade policy instruments that are both traditional, like anti-dumping and countervailing duties and safeguard measures, and those that are new, that have taken on an enormously increasing importance, whether it's investment screening, foreign subsidies, or public procurement. But they also have chosen two high-profile cases and bilateral approaches to dealing with China. One is the US-China Phase 1 trade agreement, and the other was the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, CAI. One was implemented and one was derailed. So what does that tell us about policy effectiveness towards China? And the second point about China that's really interesting in this book is the conditionality on accession. We always use the term conditionality in the European context. So we have Chinese non-compliance with WTO rules was problematic for the US and the EU. But what we find in this book is there's a patchwork of multilateral engagement by China. On the one hand, it complied with dispute outcomes. It's got a good record of compliance when losing cases in the dispute settlement system. It also, but it has not complied with anti-subsidies and the Government Procurement Act. So we end up with this patchwork of conditionality and compliance that the Europeans and the Americans are having to deal with. And so, you know, the US and EU have opted for anti-dumping and anti-subsidy investigations against China. But what it has revealed for us is how China's hoped for democratic market convergence and transition has moved to this alternative model of economic governance that you rightly point out is techno-authoritarianism, where private companies exist under a shadow of hierarchy, and we have this coercive economic statecraft and the blending of public and private functions. And so here I'm going to take a different step because the book is really, really rich and really informative. And I was struck in taking a step back on some common themes and then some questions. The first thing is, I was struck about the changing scope of trade policy and trade policy actors as the first theme. Trade policy was traditionally located with USTR, the internal market, the Trade Commission, and very much, you know, in traditional trade agencies. But now with this new geoeconomic strategy, you bring in a wider number of institutional players, Department of Defense, Homeland Security, as you pointed out, the security militarization. But even in the EU, the expansion of the role of the European Parliament in your book is very notable. So the question is, does this create more veto points? On the one hand, we would expect that. But on the other hand, we have seen a lot of passage of legislation and policy action. So we've widened the players, but we still have action, which is very interesting as a paradox. The second comment and theme was the use of traditional measures, countervailing duties, anti-dumping. And here we have really divergent trajectories on how they dealt with the non-market economy status to the market economy status of China. The EU changed its methodology and its review process. It undertook remedial action against cheap imports from China. So the EU was forced to change its policy actions and responses. The United States, from my reading of the book, doubled down on countervailing duties and AVDs. It did not alter its methodology. It moved in a Reagan-esque activist direction. And secondly, it went from a policy of reactive, responding to business complaints, to active, proactive by government. And to me, that's another form of, I don't want to call it industrial policy, but policy activism. And that was kind of an interesting observation. The third sort of theme was what you alluded to, was the notion of legislative versus executive in this European and US response to China. The EU was very formal. It was legislative policy. It was new regulations. It's very sort of formalized legislative, combining the role of the Commission and the Parliament very strongly in the book. And I'm struck by the very different nature of policymaking in the US, not just because we have trade promotion authority or not just because Congress has delegated trade authority, but because we have executive authority, executive acts in the United States, that autonomy of the executive. That's different though, because on the one hand, the legislative process in the EU is formalized and institutionalized, but if you have executive authority or executive act, it can be overturned. And so I think about, the Iran deal or the Paris climate. So I wonder if that has an impact. And so there's a lot more interagency coordination in the United States than there is in the EU. I would like you, though, to say a little bit more about the significance of party politics in the United States, because traditionally it's been Democrats versus Republicans. But as you point out in your book, and I think it's very, very important, is the coming together between some Republicans and Democrats on industrial policy and so forth, and how messy the party politics is in the United States. And then finally, is the problem the US and the EU? Because the theme in the book is a reluctance to act. No member state, according to your data, actually blocked Chinese foreign investment until 2014, before that big rise in 2016. And there was a reluctance in the US to use instruments against China, perhaps by the Obama administration and others, until really the Trump administration. So I'm struck by the reluctance to act that sort of takes place in this book. And then finally, regulating market behavior seemed to be a very common theme as well. We've moved from an expansion from efficiency, reciprocity, market access, to one about trade values about labor and the supply chains and so forth. But what's interesting in your book is this insider-outsider focus that you mentioned, because the EU is focusing on outside of regulating market behavior, the supply chains, the Uyghur, and so forth. The US is focusing similarly on those labor supply chains, including to Mexico and China. But it's also got a more internal focus of trade values about worker-centered trade policy, which also includes racial and marginalized communities. So I think that's a very important. So I'm going to ask 3 questions in my time frame. So the first one is, to what extent does subnational responses and policies and actions matter? There is variation if you think about subnational as member states. There's variation in their investment screening capacity. There is inclusion and exclusion in the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. And in the United States, we don't have competition policy. So there are a lot of subsidies and tax breaks and efforts to attract foreign direct investment by states. And California presumably is attracting venture capital, but I wonder if it's about water rights, utilities in other states. So I think the subnational actually also matters. The second comment I would say is, how does China compare to other states? Shifting from import substitution, promoting modernization of domestic economies, selectively complying with multilateral norms, and having similar restrictions on tariffs and lack of reciprocity. What is unique? Is this new? Is this just a variation of Gerschenkron's catch-up and import substitution policies? And then finally, 2 points. One is the trade-offs. Does the EU have different trade-offs than the United States? Here I think of the Zella case in Hungary, where you balanced freedom of establishment with acquisitions by third countries. And here it's an indirect role. This is about extraterritorial risks. This isn't just about China, but what happens if, China is involved in Bermuda or Jamaica or elsewhere? And so, it seems to me that the EU is balancing freedom of establishment versus these acquisitions by third countries and the role of case law. And it parallels the current sanctions issue of Russia circumventing sanctions by using third countries. And finally, so for my issue here is that different, the role of case law in the EU with this balancing of the economic freedoms of the single market than the United States? And then finally, the role of commercial reputation. I would love you to write a second book. And the second book. And here is the role of commercial reputation and risk assessment. How have firms changed their behavior and strategy in this new geo-economic political environment? What is firms' ideational response to this changing geostrategic environment? And how are they risk mitigating? How are they creating internal firewalls? Because we don't know if Trump will come back. We don't know if, policies will flip flat. We don't know what's coming down. And how are they subverting risk? Thank you.
We'll turn directly to Joachim and Dirk to respond, and then hopefully we'll have a few moments to do some audience questions as well.
Okay, shall I start, Dirk? A number of questions were directly addressed to you and to the US case, but let me perhaps start with one key question you asked. Michelle, thank you for your very insightful comments and the critical questions that you brought up. What about the addition of new veto points? How do they change the picture, the policy process? And indeed, it was astonishing you referred to the increasing role since the Lisbon Treaty of the European Parliament in trade policy, adding a veto player. But if you look at the different cases we went through, basically the European Parliament in its majority was a pro-change actor and not a status quo actor. So it went along most of the time, sometimes going further down the road towards more defensive instruments, sometimes pushed by private interest groups which have access to European Parliament, members of the European Parliament, to take a tougher line compared to the Council. And the Council, you also always found more reluctant free trade advocates from the north of Europe, from some Baltic states or the Czech Republic. They were still around this free trade coalition, but in the European Parliament, it was less strong, I would say. So meaning the more veto points not automatically lead to more policy stasis and stability. Another point that I wanted to take up, one of your questions regarding different trade-offs in the European Union compared to the US between conflicting goals. And I think one difference is really the importance of the Chinese market for some European economies and member states, notably for Germany. Why was Germany so long reluctant to go for a strengthening of trade defense instruments or to use foreign direct investment screening more comprehensively or at all, because of fear of retaliation in the Chinese market, which is so important, not only for Germany, but it was a key actor of policy changes in some fields we covered. And I think that it became clear to German actors, also the German private industry and its representative interest groups, that China moving up the value chain meant increasing losses and decreasing acceptance of an unlevel playing field for them, and fear of retaliation in the Chinese market, where they felt discriminated against anyway, was going down over time. That's my interpretation. And with regard to legislation versus executive power, I mean, one main difference is simply that the US is a state and the EU is a complex multi-level polity, which cannot use the same executive powers and freedom of maneuver and wiggle room as the US can, in case the president has a strong bipartisan backing in Congress. So this road was one that could not be taken by the EU, but has been taken by the US. So, Dirk.
So there are a lot of interesting thoughts and questions, Michelle. I very much appreciate the points. Just a couple of short answers to that. Yes, you are right. So with regarding the paradox that you mentioned with increasing the number of players, but not the actually, when you look at it, the number of veto players, I would agree. The thing is that you can only explain it in the way China galvanized or has been galvanizing the Democrats and the Republicans at the same time and to pretty much the same extent. And here it gets interesting when you talk about the party politics in the US. So, I mean, this is, of course, an open question because no one has a crystal ball to look into the future. But I would say that my impression is, or my gut feeling is, that with the GOP now ahead of the 2024 elections being more radical, so I would guess that the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans when it comes to China as a whole or towards a trade as such would increase again. Yeah, so I cannot, if you look at the Project 2025 by the Heritage Foundation, by what has been put forward by Lighthizer and others, this would really be so disruptive that I cannot see the Democrats really, so a universal baseline tariff or resigning most favored nation status. This would really send ripple effects through the global economy, and do not think that this is something that the Democrats would also agree with. With regard to the firms, yes, this is very interesting, but it's also very difficult to detect, because my impression is between what they say and what they actually do, there might be some interesting differences. So, I mean, look at Apple, yeah, with the most exposure to China. They try to, reduce their exposure by investing in India or in Vietnam, but at the same time, they're so embedded into China that they cannot pull, so to say, the plug. And so these, I mean, especially if you look at how the stock market is doing at the moment, there is a lot of problems are, so to say, just covered. And also NVIDIA, they are making extremely have huge increases in their revenues. But the problem with regard to China is kind of covered by the rest of their income streams. So I expect here a lot more trouble ahead of us in the future. And I could imagine a scenario when the whole of the situation really deteriorates, that some of the big companies like Apple or NVIDIA or others really might be at the crosshairs. This would be my one final remark, the question regarding China's future path and the Gershon perspective. I think it very much depends on how you, this is the big discussion, of course, with regard to what the China community asks. What is it that primarily drives China? Is it a business, national, or wealth and efficiency economic logic, or is it the stability, security perspective? Yeah. So, and this would kind of inform the hypothesis that you have on China's future trajectory. So I think that most people are way too optimistic when it comes to China's, well, Xi Jinping at the end of the day's logic. I think it's really way more security-oriented, stability and ideology-driven than most people would assume. But this is more or less my personal understanding, and I would admit that I'm in a minority position within the China community. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We are actually a bit over time, but I don't know if you have a few more minutes, maybe we can take some questions from the audience if everyone's okay with that. Okay. All right. So a first question is that you framed the paradigm tweaks and policy measures taken by the EU and US as responses to China and neo-mercantilism. But what about the impact of the US or the US Trump response upon the EU response or vice versa? Do they have some sort of mutual effects there? We also have a question. This is again looking forward to the future, looking more into the outlook. Are we on a road to increased economic nationalism instead of the multilateral governments we see today? Or rather to the formation of state-administered networks of reliable trade partners, at least for strategic goods and services? And then finally, you mentioned in the beginning that you assess in the book, this is a bit related, how sticky these responses, the EU and US responses, might be, whether they're likely to remain in place. And you mentioned that it seems that the US changes might be a bit more permanent because they survived the transition from the Trump to Biden administrations. But do you think that these various policy responses will be the status quo long term? So let's go with those. And thank you to the audience for the other questions. I will pass those along to the authors so they can see them, and I will share those with them. But over to you for the response.
Joachim, would you like to start?
Could you just repeat in 2 words the first question?
Yes.
I didn't see it. Yeah.
It's about the impact of the U.S. Trump response.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's I think there was an impact, notably on this anti-coercion instrument that the EU introduced. The first trigger for that was not a move from China to weaponize economic interdependence, but rather from the Trump administration, when Trump used tariffs or the threat of tariffs against France, when France introduced at the national level a taxation of the digital economy, mainly US enterprises. And that was using economic means for political ends by Trump. And that triggered the reflection on introducing such an instrument. With regard to the second question, are we on the road to increased economic nationalism, or rather formation of state-administered networks of reliable trade partners? I don't see this as being mutually exclusive. That's one part of the picture in the field of securing supply chains, notably with regard to critical raw materials, for instance. So that is, in my view, a full part of a economic nationalist strategy, which is prioritizing or emphasizing security, including security of supply goals. Dirk?
Yes, on that similar question with regard to the future and how sticky are those measures for the US, I would say they are very sticky, and I can't see at the moment any change on a less economic nationalist path. There is this one problem that is mentioned also in the chat or in the Q&A out of the audience. Isn't it aren't there trade-offs, as Michel said, or problems, inconsistencies? Yes, they are, of course. When it comes to, it's the same with Germany, we want to somehow decrease our dependency on China, but at the same time we want to have a green transformation of the industry, which means we need China to get this done, and it's the same for the US. But whenever there was a kind of a choice between the two, the US would always push for more hawkish anti-China measures. So, and also, I mean, at the end, often it depends on the people. And I would say for the US, John Kerry was pretty much sidelined. And so the other players were more important. Catherine Dye as the USTR in the Biden administration, or you have Sullivan and Antony Blinken. And they are the ones who are the more important actors, and less so the people who are dealing with China when it comes to green transition and so on. And also from the Chinese perspective, I think this is a dead-end road, because any hope that there is in Europe and also in Germany and in the US that you could somehow compartmentalize the relationship so that we have some problems with regard to human rights, we have some problems with the Chinese political economy or techno-authoritarianism on the one hand, but on the other hand, we kind of do something together to fight climate change. This is not going to work out from the Chinese perspective. Yeah. So, and for China, the situation is pretty much cast in stone. Yeah. So the US has, so to say, decided about the future of the relationship with China, its containment, as the Chinese would see it. And there is no way around it. This is one of the reasons why China is not kind of letting go or do no longer support Putin, because the argument is, what would we gain? Yeah, so would the US change their position with regard to the rise of China, with regard to Taiwan? No, they wouldn't. So from the Chinese perspective, things are on a downward slope. And what you have to do is, to prepare for the divorce. This is perhaps a bit, drastic formulation, but the Chinese are doing it. Yeah, we mentioned it shortly in the book. So it's a dual circulation, and so creating choke points for China against the West. So they, so the Chinese, at least not the Chinese, but the party state, the Xi Jinping and the Politburo, they are convinced that the US is not going to change direction, and so for them, it's they have to dig in, yeah, and they not to compromise. So I think this is basically the situation that we face, and now we all have to wait what happens in November. But actually, with no matter whether it's Trump or it's Biden, I mean, with Trump, things can be very messy and chaotic again, but also with Biden, I think that, there is some tactical adjustment, but strategically speaking, I would not expect any sea change.
Thank you very much. I hate to cut this very interesting conversation short and that we couldn't get to all of the questions, but unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today, and I really appreciate you taking the time to stay a little bit longer so we could actually get to some of these questions. Before ending the session, I would just like to let the audience know that our next webinars can be found, our schedule can be found online at eu-renew.eu. Next month, we're bringing in Barry Buzan on Making Global Society, and we're bringing in Ingrid Landau on human rights due diligence and labor governance, and Maya K. Davis-Cross on international cooperation against all odds. You can sign up for those at eu-renew.eu as usual. And thank you very much for joining us today. And for those who are still with us, thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you very much.
Strongly recommend the book. Very
Thank
strongly
you.
recommend the book.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Pleasure.
Take care.
Goodbye.